mud cakes heavily on the hem of a borrowed woolen skirt. A splintered wooden bucket bites fiercely into aging, uncalloused hands. Upstairs, in rooms smelling of stale beeswax and desperate ambition, a young bride laughs, counting titles and acreage while a smitten duke listens blindly. Downstairs, scrubbing the scullery floor, his mother listens too. Power is not always a crown or a silk gown. Sometimes, power is becoming entirely invisible in a room where the greedy forget that servants have ears. Constance stood before the floor-length mirror in her dressing room, staring at a stranger. For 40 years she had been the Duchess of Oakhaven. Her skin was used to the cool, heavy slide of imported silk, the rigid, unforgiving embrace of whalebone corsets, and the suffocating weight of pearls. Today she wore a dress of coarse, undyed wool that smelled faintly of damp sheep and lye soap. It scratched at her collarbone with every breath. Her maid, a fiercely loyal woman named Beatrice, who had been weeping silently for 20 minutes, fastened the rough apron around Constance's waist. "Your Grace, I beg you," Beatrice whispered, her hands trembling as she pinned a plain cotton cap over Constance's silver hair. "It is madness. If the young Duke finds out—" "Arthur will not find out until I am ready for him to," Constance said. Her voice was a dry rasp, devoid of the theatrical warmth her son usually received. She turned away from the mirror. The lack of stays made her spine feel terrifyingly unsupported. She was 62 years old. Her left hip ached when it rained, and the knuckles of her right hand were beginning to swell with the hard, aching knots of rheumatism. She was not built for labor, but she was built for war. Arthur's letter lay on the vanity, a piece of heavy parchment overflowing with naive, breathless adoration. "Mother, you must meet her. Cecily is an angel. The Harrow family is old and proud, though they have fallen on quiet times. She asks for nothing but my heart." Constance did not believe in angels, and she certainly did not believe in the nobility of impoverished gentry. The Harrows had been bleeding money for a decade. Now suddenly they had snared the wealthiest unmarried duke in the country. Constance knew exactly how that trap was laid. She had laid one herself a lifetime ago. "Aucassin, the carriage is waiting by the servants' gate," Beatrice said, sniffling. "It will take you to the village. You will have to walk the last mile to the Harrow estate. It rained in the night, Your Grace. The roads are a slurry." "Good," Constance said. She rubbed her hands in the hearth ash, staining her manicured cuticles a dark, permanent-looking gray. "Poverty is rarely clean. Give me the basket." The journey stripped away the last vestiges of her pride. By the time Constance reached the back entrance of Oak Hill Manor, her boots, cheap, stiff leather that pinched her toes, were coated in thick, yellow mud. The hem of her skirt was heavy and wet, slapping coldly against her ankles. She was shivering. The cold bit into the marrow of her bones, a deep, pervasive chill that no fire could fully banish. She stood before the peeling paint of the kitchen door and raised her hand. It felt impossibly heavy. She knocked. The door was yanked open by a girl no older than 14, her face smeared with flour and panic. A wall of heat and the sharp, stinging scent of burned onions rolled out of the kitchen, hitting Constance in the face. "You the help from the village?" the girl snapped, not waiting for an answer. She grabbed Constance by the sleeve and hauled her inside. "About time. Mrs. Cobb is ready to take a cleaver to someone's skull. Leave your boots by the coal chute, put these on, and get to the sink." Constance was shoved toward a wooden bench. A pair of oversized wooden clogs were kicked at her feet. She stared at them. For a fraction of a second, the Dowager Duchess of Oakhaven rose in her throat, ready to demand the girl be flogged for her insolence. Then, the damp wool scratched her neck, and she remembered where she was. "Right away," Constance mumbled, keeping her chin tucked against her chest. She adopted a slight stoop, letting the natural ache in her spine pronounce itself. She became Martha. The kitchen of Oak Hill Manor was a cavern of chaos. The plaster ceiling was black with years of poorly vented grease. Copper pots, dented and dull, hung from iron hooks. The air was a suffocating cocktail of roasting meat, sweat, and cheap tallow candles. At the center of it all stood Mrs. Cobb, a massive woman with a face the color of raw beef, barking orders with terrifying precision. Constance was thrust toward a deep stone sink piled high with carrots and potatoes still crusted in the garden dirt. A dull paring knife was thrust into her hand. "Peel," the kitchen maid ordered. "And if you leave an ounce of flesh on those skins, Mrs. Cobb will take it out of your hide." Constance plunged her hands into the icy water in the basin. The shock of it made her gasp. The knife was blunt, the wooden handle slick with grease. Her first attempt at peeling a carrot resulted in the blade slipping and nicking her thumb. A bright bead of blood welled up, mixing with the muddy water. She did not cry out. She sucked the blood from her thumb, tasting copper and dirt, and picked up the knife again. "She asks for nothing but my heart," Arthur had written. Constance dug the blade into a potato, peeling away the rot. "We shall see about that," she thought, the cold water numbing her hands to the bone. By her third hour at the sink, Constance realized that hell was not made of fire and brimstone. Hell was a stone floor, a blunt knife, and an endless mountain of root vegetables. Her lower back screamed in protest with every shift of her weight. The oversized clogs had already rubbed raw, weeping blisters onto her heels. The heat of the massive open hearth was blistering, yet the drafts cutting through the cracked window panes were icy. She felt simultaneously roasted and frozen. But as the physical agony set in, so did the clarity. Servants, Constance quickly learned, were the true masters of any house. They held its secrets in their chapped hands, and because they were treated as furniture, they spoke as if the room were empty. "Butcher's boy came around back an hour ago," a scullery maid hissed to the girl washing dishes next to Constance. The girl's forearms were red and scaled from the harsh lye soap. "Did he bring the veal?" "Brought a ledger is what he brought," the scullery maid scoffed, wiping her nose on the back of her sleeve. "Said his master won't extend Lady Harrow's credit another inch. Swore up and down he'd go to the magistrate. Mrs. Cobb had to give him 2 silver spoons from the dining room just to get him to leave the pork loin." Constance kept her head down, her knife moving slowly over a turnip. Silver spoons. The Harrows were pawning their own silverware to feed their guests. "Don't matter now," the dishwasher muttered, scrubbing a blackened pot. "Miss Cecily has the Duke of Oakhaven hooked through the gills. Once the knot is tied, all this debt gets swept under a heavy rug." "Did you see the dress the seamstress brought this morning?" The scullery maid's voice dripped with bitter envy. "Blue silk from Paris. Cost more than this whole estate is worth. Seamstress wouldn't hand it over until Miss Cecily signed a promissory note directly against the Duke's estate." Constance's knife slipped again, slicing a long, shallow cut across her index finger. She hissed in pain, dropping the turnip with a heavy splash into the murky water. "Clumsy old cow!" Mrs. Cobb's voice boomed over the din. A heavy hand smacked the back of Constance's head, knocking her cap askew. "Mind the splashes. That's drinking water for the dogs. You waste a drop and I'll dock your pay." Rage, pure and blinding, flared in Constance's chest. Her head snapped up, her gray eyes locking onto the cook. For a moment, the heavy air in the kitchen seemed to stop. Constance's expression was not that of a beaten village woman. It was the look of a woman who commanded a small army, who had brought arrogant lords to their knees with a single raised eyebrow. Mrs. Cobb faltered, stepping back, a flicker of genuine unease crossing her fleshy face. Then Constance's knee buckled slightly from the standing, and the illusion broke. She swallowed the copper taste of fury, forcing her eyes to the floor. "My apologies, Mum. Hands are stiff." Mrs. Cobb cleared her throat, shaking off the momentary intimidation. "Keep 'em moving. The young Duke arrives by carriage in 2 hours. Everything must be flawless." Constance wrapped her bleeding finger in a dirty scrap of linen she tore from her apron pocket. Her son was coming. Arthur, with his open, trusting face and his desperate need to be loved. Since his father had died of a sudden fever 3 years ago, Arthur had been adrift. He was too gentle for the predatory waters of the peerage. He wanted a family, He wanted a sanctuary. Instead, he was walking into a slaughterhouse. "Martha!" Constance blinked, turning toward the pantry. A footman in a moth-eaten livery was leaning heavily against the doorframe. He smelled strongly of stale gin and unwashed wool. His eyes were red-rimmed. "The upstairs maid took sick. Threw up her morning porridge in the linen closet," the footman slurred, waving a dismissive hand. "Lady Harrow wants tea in the drawing-room for her and Miss Cecily before the Duke arrives. You're the only one not covered in grease. Wash your hands and take the tray." Constance froze. "Me? Are you deaf, old woman?" "Yes, you. Just don't look them in the eye and don't speak unless spoken to." A dark, cold thrill shot through Constance's exhaustion. This was what she had come for. She dried her aching hands on her apron, ignoring the stinging of her cuts. She followed the footman to the prep table, where a heavy silver tray, tarnished around the handles, was loaded with a porcelain teapot, 3 delicate cups, and a plate of meager dry biscuits. "Straight up the servants' stairs, second door on the left," the footman grunted, turning back to his hidden flask. Constance lifted the tray. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of the silver pulling at the taut muscles in her shoulders. Her boots clunked clumsily on the stone floor, but as she reached the wooden steps of the servants' stairwell, she forced her tread to lighten. She ascended into the belly of the beast, the smell of damp stone fading into the scent of old carpet and cheap rosewater. The upstairs hallway of Oak Hill Manor was a masterclass in desperate illusion. The wallpaper was dark, heavy damask, clearly chosen to hide the water stains bleeding through the plaster. The floorboards creaked beneath the faded, threadbare rugs. Constance paused outside the heavy oak doors of the drawing-room. Her breath was shallow. The tray in her hands rattled slightly, the porcelain cups clinking against their saucers. She closed her eyes, forced her breathing to slow, and pushed the door open with her hip. The drawing-room was bathed in late afternoon sunlight, which only served to highlight the dust motes dancing in the air and the faded patches on the velvet upholstery. Sitting on a chaise lounge by the window was Cecily Harrow. Arthur had called her an angel. Constance could see why a lonely young man might think so. Cecily possessed a fragile porcelain beauty, pale skin, large, liquid blue eyes, and spun gold hair arranged in perfect, careless ringlets. She wore a day dress of pale yellow muslin that hugged her narrow waist. But as Constance stepped quietly into the room, she saw the tension in the girl's jaw. The angel was currently gnawing on her thumbnail, her foot tapping rapidly against the floorboards. Across from her sat Lady Harrow, a woman entirely composed of sharp angles and nervous energy. She wore a gown that was 5 years out of fashion, dyed a dark purple to hide the wear. Neither woman looked at Constance as she approached the low mahogany table. To them, she was simply a piece of moving furniture in a gray woolen dress. Constance bent her aching knees, setting the heavy tray down without a sound. She stepped back, keeping her head bowed, her hands folded over her apron. She was supposed to pour. "He is late," Cecily snapped. Her voice was not the melodic chime Arthur had described. It was thin, reedy, and vibrating with irritation. "He's a duke, Cecily," Lady Harrow said, rubbing her temples. "He's allowed to be late. You just need to ensure that when he arrives, you look exactly as fragile and adoring as you did in London. Do not let him see your temper." "My temper is fine. It is my patience that is wearing thin." Cecily reached out, grabbing a dry biscuit from the plate and snapping it in half. Crumbs showered the carpet. "If I have to listen to him wax poetic about his father's prize hounds one more time, I might throw myself from the carriage." Constance reached forward, her arthritic fingers wrapping around the handle of the teapot. The porcelain was hot. She poured the dark, fragrant tea into the first cup, her hand miraculously steady. "You will listen to him talk about hounds and horses and the weather, and you will smile," Lady Harrow hissed, leaning forward. "Do you understand our position, Cecily? The butcher threatened to go to the magistrate today. Your father is hiding in the study with a bottle of brandy because he cannot face the creditors. Arthur is not just a husband. He is our survival." "I know that, Mother." Cecily sighed, rolling her eyes. He is easy enough to manage. He's soft, like dough. He looks at me like a lost puppy. Once the ring is firmly on my finger, I will mold him. We will spend the season in London, away from the country dirt, and he will pay for it all. Constance moved to pour the second cup. Her knuckles were white. Her heart beat a slow, dangerous rhythm against her ribs. And what of the dowager? Lady Harrow asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, completely ignoring the servant standing inches away. Cecily let out a short, cruel laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. The Dowager Duchess Constance? Please, she is an aging relic. Arthur's terrified of her, but I am not. They say she is formidable, Lady Harrow warned, taking the cup Constance offered her without making eye contact. They say she runs the Oakhaven estates with an iron fist. She controls the purse strings until Arthur marries. Exactly, Cecily said, her blue eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. Until he marries. Once I'm Duchess, she becomes a guest in my house, a nuisance. She will not step aside quietly, Cecily. She is fiercely protective of him. Then she will find herself very lonely, Cecily said smoothly, admiring her own reflection in the silver teapot. Arthur wants a wife, not a warden. I will convince him her health is failing. The country air of the far northern estates will do her good. We will lock the old bat in the dower house and leave her to rot with her ledgers. If she fights me, I will simply cry, and Arthur will banish her himself to protect my delicate nerves. Constance's breath caught in her throat. The sheer, naked malice in the girl's voice was staggering. It wasn't just greed. It was an eagerness to destroy. She didn't just want Arthur's money. She wanted to isolate him, to break his bond with the only family he had left. Constance moved to hand Cecily her teacup. Her hands, which had been so steady, suddenly betrayed her. A tremor of raw fury traveled down her arm. As the saucer met Cecily's outstretched hand, the cup rattled. A single dark drop of hot tea splashed over the rim, landing squarely on the pale yellow muslin of Cecily's lap. The silence that followed was total. Cecily stared at the small brown stain blooming on her dress. Then, slowly, she looked up. For the first time, the girl actually looked at Constance. The beautiful, angelic face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. Without a word, Cecily's hand lashed out. The slap echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. The force of it snapped Constance's head to the side. Her vision swam. The taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth had cut into her inner cheek. Her ear rang violently. "You stupid, clumsy old cow!" Cecily shrieked, springing up from the chaise lounge, her fists clenched. "Do you know what this silk costs? It costs more than your miserable life." Constance slowly turned her head back. Her cheek burned like fire. She tasted the copper in her mouth. She did not raise a hand to her face. She simply stood there, her gray eyes locking onto Cecily's furious blue ones. The stoop in her shoulders vanished. The deferential tilt of her head disappeared. In that moment, she was no longer Martha. Before Constance could speak, before she could unleash the devastation sitting heavy on her tongue, the heavy oak doors of the drawing room swung open with a bang. "Cecily? Lady Harrow?" The voice was deep, warm, and currently laced with confusion. Arthur stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his heavy riding coat, his dark hair windblown, a bouquet of wildly expensive hothouse roses clutched in his hand. He stared at the scene before him, his angelic bride, face contorted in rage, hand still raised from the strike, and an old servant woman standing perfectly straight, bleeding from the mouth. Arthur's eyes moved from Cecily's flushed face to the servant. He frowned. He looked closer. The bouquet of roses slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a soft, dull thud. "Mother?" Arthur whispered, the word hanging in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Arthur stepped fully into the room. His heavy riding boots crushed the delicate fallen petals of the roses he had dropped, releasing a bruised, sweet scent that clashed violently with the stale dust of the drawing room. He stared at the woman in the gray woolen dress. He looked at the oversized, muddy clogs. He looked at the raw, swollen knuckles wrapped in dirty linen. And finally, he looked at the bright, angry welt rising on her left cheek. "Mother?" Arthur repeated. His voice cracked, stripping away the booming confidence of a duke and leaving behind the thin, reedy confusion of a boy. Cecily's arm was still suspended in the air. For 3 agonizing seconds, her brain refused to process the impossibility of the scene. Her blue eyes darted from Arthur's pale, horrified face to the old woman's unblinking gray stare. "Arthur, darling," Cecily started, her voice automatically seeking its usual honeyed register, though it shook terribly. She lowered her hand, tucking it behind the folds of her skirt. You are early. This clumsy wretch ruined my gown. I only meant to—" "Quiet." The word did not come from Arthur. It came from Constance. She did not yell. She did not raise her voice above a conversational murmur. But the command carried the absolute, bone-deep authority of a woman who had dictated the fates of thousands for 4 decades. It hit the room like a physical blow. Cecily snapped her mouth shut, her teeth clicking together. Constance turned her head slowly, testing the mobility of her jaw. She brought a rough, ash-stained thumb to her lip, wiping away a smear of red. The metallic taste of her own blood coated her tongue. Her cheek felt hot, throbbing in time with her pulse, but her spine remained terrifyingly straight. "You have a heavy hand for an angel, Miss Harrow," Constance said. The deferential, mumbled slur she had used downstairs was gone. Her diction was razor-sharp, every consonant clipped and precise. Behind Cecily, Lady Harrow made a sound like a strangled hen. The older woman stood up so fast her knees struck the low tea table. The entire silver tray jolted. A fragile porcelain teacup tipped over the edge and struck the floorboards, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. The sharp crack broke Arthur's paralysis. "Mother, what is this?" He took a step forward, his hands opening and closing at his sides. He looked sick. His gaze darted to Cecily, begging for an explanation that made sense, and then back to Constance. "Why are you wearing rags? Why are you bleeding?" "Because I wanted to know the price of your bride, Arthur," Constance said smoothly. She reached down, unknotting the coarse apron from her waist and letting it fall in a crumpled heap over the tea stain on the floor. "And I have learned it. You will be glad to know she does not want your money." Arthur blinked, a desperate, pathetic relief washing over his features. He looked at Cecily. "You see? I told you, Mother, she isn't— She wants your compliance," Constance interrupted, her voice dropping a register, cold and flat. "She wants your estate. She wants to use your wealth to wash away a mountain of quiet, dirty debts. And she wants to lock your mother in a dower house so she can reign over the ashes of your independence." Cecily's face lost all its color, leaving her looking like a wax doll. "Arthur, that is a lie. She is mad. Look at her. She came creeping into our home in disguise like a common thief." "I came as Martha," Constance corrected softly, finally breaking her gaze from Arthur to pin Cecily to the spot. "And Martha learned quite a bit. Martha learned that your butcher's boy requires 2 silver spoons from your dining room just to leave the evening roast. Martha learned that the seamstress in the village holds a promissory note for Paris silk, leveraged illegally against my son's unwedded name." Lady Harrow let out a gasp, clutching her throat. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, as if expecting the creditors to burst through the oak doors. "Lies!" Cecily shrieked, the sweet facade crumbling entirely. The shrill, reedy panic returned. She rushed to Arthur, grabbing the lapels of his heavy riding coat. "Arthur, you cannot listen to this. She hates me. She has always hated me because I have your heart. She's trying to poison you against me. Tell her to leave." Arthur stood perfectly still. He did not put his arms around her. He looked down at the pale, delicate hands clutching his coat. Then he looked at his mother's hands, stained with soot, bleeding from the paring knife and shaking slightly from the cold. Did you strike her? Arthur asked. His voice was very quiet. Cecily froze. She looked up into Arthur's face. The soft, doughy adoration she had mocked just minutes ago was gone. In its place was a terrible, suffocating stillness. She burned me, Cecily cried, gesturing wildly to the brown stain on her yellow dress. She poured boiling tea on me on purpose. What was I supposed to do, Arthur? She's a vicious, cruel old woman. She is the Duchess of Oakhaven, Arthur said. The words seemed to scrape against his throat as they came out. And she is my mother. The silence in the drawing room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a rhythmic, mocking metronome measuring the death of a future. Constance felt a deep, agonizing cramp seize her left calf. The chill of her wet boots was creeping up her legs, settling into her joints. She wanted nothing more than to sit down on the velvet chaise lounge, to call for a glass of brandy, to close her eyes. But she could not show weakness. Not yet. Arthur, please! Lady Harrow finally spoke, her voice trembling. She stepped out from behind the table, wringing her hands. This is a terrible misunderstanding. The debts are a temporary embarrassment, an oversight by my husband's steward. Cecily loves you. She has done nothing but weep with joy since your proposal. She was weeping just 10 minutes ago, Constance observed dryly, not taking her eyes off the mother. Weeping over the prospect of having to listen to my son speak about his prize hounds. She finds him incredibly dull, you see. Arthur flinched. The small, involuntary movement was worse than if he had shouted. He closed his eyes, and Constance saw the muscles in his jaw bunch as he swallowed hard. Arthur, stop! Cecily demanded, shaking his lapels. Look at me! Don't look at her! Look at me! Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at the girl he had planned to spend his life with. Did you call me Doe, Cecily? Cecily's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The calculation in her eyes was frantic, naked, and ugly. She was trying to weigh the exact percentage of the conversation Constance had overheard. She was searching for a lie large enough to cover the truth, but the silence had already condemned her. She called you a lost puppy, Constance provided helpfully. The cruelty of her own words tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated doing this to him. She hated tearing away the veil and exposing the rot, but a broken heart was preferable to a gutted life. She said you were soft, easily managed, and once the ring was on her finger, she would mold you. Arthur slowly reached up. He wrapped his large gloved hands around Cecily's wrists, prying her fingers off his coat one by one. His grip was not violent, but it was absolute. He lowered her arms and stepped back, putting 2 feet of physical distance between them. The silver spoons, Arthur said, his voice flat. Is that true, Lady Harrow? Have you been pawning your silver to feed me at your table? Lady Harrow burst into tears. It was a pathetic, loud sobbing that held no dignity. She sank onto the chaise lounge, burying her face in her hands. We had to, Your Grace. We had nothing left. The harvests failed, the investments. We were drowning. Cecily was our only hope. Your hope, Arthur repeated. The word sounded hollow. You see? Cecily spat, pivoting with whiplash speed. The tears in her own eyes evaporated, replaced by a hard, cornered fury. If she could not play the victim, she would play the victimizer. You see what she does? Your mother couldn't stand the thought of you loving someone else. She had to sneak into my home, humiliate my family, and spy on us like a common rat just to keep you tied to her apron strings. Constance didn't blink. I prefer Martha, actually. I'm told I peel a very competent turnip. Cecily sneered, turning her back on Constance to focus entirely on Arthur. Grow up, Arthur. Look around you. The peerage is built on arrangements. Do you really think any woman of standing is marrying you for your hounds and your poetry? You are a duke. I offer you beauty, a flawless pedigree, and a quiet life. In exchange, you pay my father's debts. It is a business transaction. Everyone knows it but you. The brutal honesty hung in the air. The smell of the spilled tea, now cooling and bitter, seemed to permeate the room. Constance watched her son. This was the precipice. This was the moment the boy who wrote breathless poetry about angels would either break or harden into the man he needed to be. She held her breath, the pain in her cheek forgotten. Arthur looked at Cecily. He looked at the beautiful porcelain face, now twisted with a cynical superiority. "A transaction," Arthur murmured. "Yes," Cecily said, lifting her chin. "And a very fair one. Now tell your mother to get out of my drawing room before I have the footman throw her out." Arthur let out a breath. It was a long, shaky exhale that seemed to empty his lungs entirely. When he inhaled again, his shoulders squared. The boyish, eager slump he usually carried was gone. "I think," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the distinct, heavy resonance of the Oakhaven lords before him, "that you have vastly miscalculated the terms of this transaction, Miss Harrow." Cecily frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "Arthur." "Do not address me by my Christian name," Arthur cut her off. It was a verbal execution. The casual intimacy was severed instantly. Cecily physically recoiled. Lady Harrow's sobbing hitched into a terrified silence. Arthur turned away from his former fiancée. He walked over to where the shattered teacup lay on the floorboards. He bent down, the heavy leather of his coat creaking, and picked up a jagged shard of porcelain with his gloved hand. He turned it over, studying the delicate, faded blue paint. "I loved you," Arthur said to the piece of broken china. He didn't sound angry. He sounded profoundly tired. "I loved the woman I thought you were. I would have given you anything. I would have emptied my vaults for your father. I would have bought you Paris silk until you drowned in it, simply because you asked." He dropped the shard. It hit the floor with a dull clink. "But you didn't ask," Arthur said, finally looking up at Cecily. His eyes were cold, hollowed out by betrayal. "You demanded, you manipulated, and you struck my mother." "She poured tea on me," Cecily screamed, the panic finally breaking through her cynical armor. She realized too late the gravity of what she had lost. The Oakhaven fortune was walking out the door. "She provoked me. You cannot abandon me over a momentary lapse of temper." "I am not abandoning you, Miss Harrow," Arthur said evenly. "I am simply declining the business arrangement. The engagement is broken." Lady Harrow let out a wail, slumping sideways against the armrest of the chaise lounge. Cecily stared at Arthur, her chest heaving, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. "You coward!" Cecily hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "You pathetic, weak little boy. You will never be a real man. You will just be her puppet for the rest of your miserable life." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply looked at her as if she were a stranger asking for directions in a language he did not speak. He turned his back on her. He walked across the room, the crushed rose petals sticking to the soles of his boots. He stopped in front of Constance. Constance looked up at her son. He was a head taller than her. She saw the raw, pulsing pain behind his eyes, the devastation he was desperately trying to mask. She had protected him from the world's cruelty for so long, only to be the one to serve it to him on a tarnished silver tray. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I'm sorry. Do not apologize, Mother," Arthur said softly. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently touching the uninjured side of her face. "You did what a mother does. You pulled me out of the fire before I burned." He lowered his hand and offered her his arm. Constance looked at the crook of his elbow. It was steady. She reached out with her aching, cut hands, ignoring the pain in her joints, and looped her arm through his. "Let us go home," Arthur said. "Yes," Constance agreed, leaning heavily against him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her feeling every hour of her 62 years. "I believe I have peeled enough root vegetables for one lifetime." They turned toward the heavy oak doors. They did not look back. They did not look at the weeping mother on the chaise lounge, or the furious, ruined girl standing in the center of the room. As they crossed the threshold, stepping back into the dim, heavy-carpeted hallway, Arthur paused. He turned his head slightly over his shoulder, his voice carrying back into the drawing room one last time. "Oh, and Miss Harrow?" Silence answered him, save for Lady Harrow's muffled sobs. "The Paris silk seamstress," Arthur said coldly. "I will inform my steward to honor the promissory note you forged in my name. Consider it a parting gift. I would hate for you to look anything less than perfect when the magistrate comes to collect your silver." He pulled the heavy oak door shut behind them. The satisfying heavy click of the latch echoed in the hallway, sealing the Harrows in their ruin. The air in the servants' stairwell was noticeably colder than the drawing room. It smelled of mice and damp plaster. As Constance let Arthur lead her down the narrow, creaking steps, the adrenaline that had held her spine rigid began to drain away. It left behind a sickening, hollow exhaustion. Her knees protested with every downward step. The oversized wooden clogs, which had merely rubbed her heels raw an hour ago, now felt as though they were filled with crushed glass. She gripped Arthur's forearm, feeling the dense, expensive weave of his riding coat and the solid muscle beneath it. He was a man. When had that happened? They reached the heavy door that led back into the kitchen. Arthur did not knock. He pushed it open with a flat palm. The chaos of Mrs. Cobb's domain was in full swing, a crescendo of clattering copper and shouted orders in anticipation of the Duke's arrival. The sudden draft of a cold air from the stairwell made the flames in the massive hearth dance violently. "I told you to take the tray and come straight back, you lazy—" Mrs. Cobb turned, wiping her greasy hands on her apron, the insult dying instantly in her throat. The kitchen fell dead silent. The scullery maid dropped a pewter mug. It hit the stone floor with a deafening clatter, rolling in a slow, agonizing circle until it bumped against a sack of onions. They were staring at Arthur. A duke did not belong in a kitchen. He was an alien creature here, entirely out of scale with the soot-stained walls and the hanging strings of garlic. But then their eyes drifted from the velvet collar of his coat, down his arm, to the woman leaning against him, the woman in the mud-caked boots, the woman with the swelling, purpling welt on her cheek and the blood-stained rag wrapped around her finger. Martha. Constance met Mrs. Cobb's horrified, bulging eyes. She did not gloat. She simply looked at the cook with the dull, flat exhaustion of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and found it exactly as filthy as she expected. Arthur did not speak to the staff. He did not acknowledge their existence. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door that led out to the kitchen garden. He guided Constance through the maze of prep tables and boiling pots, his jaw locked tight. The staff parted for them like water, shrinking back against the stone walls, holding their breath. When Arthur pulled open the back door, the biting chill of the late afternoon hit Constance like a physical blow. The sky had turned the color of bruised iron. The wind whipped her coarse woolen skirt against her legs. Waiting in the muddy lane beyond the garden gate was not the battered village cart Constance had arrived in, but a massive, gleaming black carriage bearing the gold crest of Oakhaven. 4 perfectly matched gray geldings snorted plumes of white vapor into the freezing air. A footman in pristine blue and silver livery leaped down from the back, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, though his eyes widened slightly as he took in Constance's appearance. He scrambled to pull down the iron steps and open the carriage door. Arthur helped her up. The transition from the biting wind into the plush, velvet-lined interior of the carriage was dizzying. Constance sank into the soft leather cushions. The contrast was almost painful. The carriage smelled of beeswax, expensive leather, and the lingering scent of Arthur's sandalwood shaving soap. Arthur climbed in after her. He pulled the door shut, sealing them inside a quiet, swaying cocoon. He reached up, rapping his knuckles sharply twice against the wooden roof. The carriage lurched forward. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The rhythm of the horses' hooves on the rutted road was a steady, thumping heartbeat in the enclosed space. Constance stared at her hands resting in her lap. The knuckles were red and swollen, the skin deeply stained with soot that had worked its way into the fine lines of her skin. The rag around her finger was damp. Her left cheek throbbed with a dull, persistent heat. She looked up at Arthur. He was sitting opposite her, staring out the window at the bleak passing landscape of barren winter trees. His face was a closed book. The devastatingly open, eager boy who had ridden out this morning with hothouse roses was gone. "Arthur!" she rasped. Her throat felt tight, coated in dust. He didn't turn his head. "You are shivering, Mother." He reached under the seat, pulling out a heavy fur-lined lap-robe. He leaned forward and draped it over her knees, tucking the edges around her muddy boots. His hands lingered for a fraction of a second on the coarse wool of her borrowed skirt, feeling the dampness. "I'm fine," Constance said, though her teeth were beginning to chatter. "You are not," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of inflection. "You're bleeding, you're frozen, and you were struck by a woman I was prepared to make my wife." He finally looked at her. His eyes were hollow, rimmed with a terrible, weary red. "I am sorry I humiliated you," Constance said softly. It was the only apology that mattered. She had dragged his pride out into the mud for everyone to see. Arthur shook his head slowly. "You didn't humiliate me. You illuminated me. There is a vast difference." He leaned back against the leather squabs, closing his eyes. I wanted it to be real, Mother. I wanted to build something that was mine, not an estate I inherited, not a title I was born into. Just a home." "A home cannot be built on a foundation of lies, Arthur," Constance said gently. "It will sink." "I know." He let out a long, shuddering breath. "I know." He did not speak again for the rest of the journey. Constance closed her eyes, letting the sway of the carriage rock her into a state of numb suspension. The victory she had secured for her son felt heavy, tasting of copper and cold tea. She had saved him from a predator, but in doing so, she had butchered his innocence. She wasn't sure which offense was worse. The return to Oakhaven was a blur of frantic, hushed activity. When the carriage pulled into the sweeping gravel drive of the estate, the sun had fully set. The massive stone facade of the manor house was ablaze with candlelight. As the footman opened the door, Beatrice, Constance's loyal maid, was already rushing down the front steps, flanked by the estate physician and a small army of worried servants. Arthur did not let the footman help his mother down. He carried her. He lifted Constance in his arms as easily as if she were a child, her muddy clogs dangling, her ruined clothes staining his immaculate coat. He carried her up the stone steps, past the gaping servants, and straight up the grand staircase to her private chambers. The next 3 hours were an agonizing exercise in restoration. The hot water of the porcelain hip bath stung her blistered heels so fiercely that Constance had to bite down on a towel to keep from crying out. Beatrice scrubbed the hearth ash from her mistress's skin with harsh, sobbing breaths. The gray soot had settled deep into Constance's pores, requiring 3 separate basins of water to fully extract. The estate physician, a quiet, pragmatic man named Dr. Eris, examined the cut on her finger. "A dirty blade," he murmured, applying a stinging antiseptic tincture that smelled of iodine and alcohol. "We will need to keep it wrapped to prevent festering. The knuckles are severely inflamed, Your Grace. The cold has aggravated the rheumatism." He then moved to her face. He gently prodded the swollen, bruised flesh of her cheek. Constance flinched. "A blunt impact," Dr. Eris noted, his eyes flickering with unspoken questions he was too smart to ask. "Ice, Beatrice, wrapped in clean linen. Keep it pressed to the cheekbone for 20 minutes at a time." When they were finally done, Constance was dressed in a soft, heavy nightgown of white flannel. Her feet were wrapped in unguents and bandages. Her left hand was tightly bound. She sat in the armchair by the roaring fire in her bedroom, feeling entirely hollowed out. The coarse, scratchy ghost of the woolen servant's dress still lingered on her skin. "Where is my son?" Constance asked, her voice finally returning to its normal, commanding timbre, though it rasped slightly. Beatrice looked down, adjusting the ice pack against Constance's cheek. "His Grace locked himself in his study, my lady. He gave strict orders not to be disturbed. He asked for a bottle of whiskey and the estate ledgers. Nothing else. Constance nodded slowly. Leave him be. For the next 4 days, Oakhaven felt like a mausoleum. Arthur did not emerge from the west wing. Trays of food were left outside the heavy oak door of his study. They were brought back to the kitchens mostly untouched. The servants walked on eggshells, communicating in whispers. The story of the Dowager Duchess returning in rags and bruises had spread through the backstairs gossip mill like wildfire, mutating into a dozen different, exaggerated legends. Constance did not seek Arthur out. It took every ounce of her formidable willpower to stay away from the study. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to go to him, to comfort him, to smooth his hair and tell him that the pain would pass. But she couldn't. He was a duke. A duke could not be coddled through a betrayal. He had to metabolize it himself, or it would rot inside him. She spent her days in her private sitting room, nursing her aching joints and staring into the fire. The bruise on her cheek turned a spectacular, ugly shade of greenish yellow. She thought often of her own marriage to Arthur's father. She had been 19. He had been 35. It had been a transaction arranged over a mahogany table in London, involving vast tracts of timberland and a dowry that could fund a small war. There had been no talk of angels or lost puppies. There had only been duty. Love had come later, slowly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared endurance. It had not been a poetic, breathless romance. It had been a sturdy, quiet partnership. She had wanted better for Arthur. She had wanted him to have the blinding, consuming fire of true romance that the poets lied about. But the world was not built for soft boys who trusted easily. The world was built for wolves. On the evening of the 5th day, it rained, a heavy freezing downpour that lashed against the tall windows of Constance's sitting room. The door clicked open. Constance did not turn her head from the fire. She heard the heavy, deliberate tread of Arthur's boots on the Persian rug. He stopped beside her armchair. She looked up at him. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved. A dark, rough shadow of beard covered his jaw. His eyes were deeply shadowed, and the linen shirt he wore was rumpled, smelling faintly of old wood smoke and whiskey. He looked, for the first time in his life, dangerous. Arthur pulled a wooden chair from the writing desk and dragged it over to the hearth. He sat down heavily, leaning his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. For a long time the only sound was the snapping of the logs and the rain beating against the glass. The steward reviewed the Harrow's finances, Arthur said softly. His voice was gravelly from disuse. It is worse than you heard in the kitchens. They are drowning in debt to 3 different gambling syndicates in London. The father wagered the estate deeds last autumn. The butchers and seamstresses were just the surface scum. Constance said nothing. She let him talk. He stayed in the bathroom for 10 minutes, sitting on the closed lid of the toilet, just breathing in the scent of his own cheap synthetic pine soap, trying to build the walls back up. He had survived the last 6 months by being a ghost, by being cynical, cold, and untouchable. He couldn't let Elias dismantle that armor just because the alpha knew how to take off a shoe. When Arthur finally unlocked the door and stepped out, the apartment was completely silent. You were not stupid, Arthur, Constance said firmly. You were generous. Generosity is not a flaw, but it must be guarded by a very high wall. Arthur stared at the fading yellow bruise on her cheek. He reached out, his fingers hovering an inch from her face, before pulling his hand back. The mattress wasn't just a bed. In the weeks following his 2nd trimester, Arthur's biology had forcibly demanded a nest, a safe, heavily scented place to prepare for the pup. But Arthur had no alpha. He had no pack. He had no safe place. Arthur leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. I sent a writer to the magistrate this morning. I formally withdrew the Oakhaven name from any association with the Harrow estate. I also sent a letter to the London creditors, informing them that I hold no financial obligations toward Lord Harrow. Constance's eyebrows rose slightly. It was a brutal, decisive move. By formally severing ties, he was throwing the Harrows directly to the wolves. That is a severe action. she noted quietly. It is a necessary one, Arthur said. His voice hardened, the soft dough fully baked into something rigid. I will honor the seamstress's promissory note for the dress, as I promised, because I am a man of my word. But I will not be made a fool of, and I will not allow anyone who strikes my family to walk away without consequences. He looked at Constance, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. The boy was truly gone. The Duke of Oakhaven had arrived. I need you to show me the ledgers, Mother, Arthur said. It was not a request. It was a statement of intent. All of them. The tenant disputes, the timber yields, the investments. I have let you carry the weight of this estate for too long while I played at being a gentleman. It is time I learned how to be a lord. Constance felt a strange, complex knot of emotion tighten in her chest. Relief, pride, and a deep, unexpected sorrow. Her tenure as the sole architect of Oakhaven was ending. Her son no longer needed her protection. He needed her tutelage. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, Constance said, letting a faint, approving smile touch the corners of her mouth. In the library. Do not be late. Arthur nodded. He stood up, towering over her. He bent down and kissed the crown of her silver hair. Thank you, Mother, for going into the mud for me. Just make sure, Constance murmured, looking back at the fire, that you never make me put on those dreadful wooden clogs again. A small, genuine huff of laughter escaped Arthur's chest. I promise. Winter tightened its grip on the valley, freezing the mud into hard, unforgiving ridges and covering the sprawling lawns of Oakhaven in a thick blanket of frost. Inside the manor, a shift had occurred. It was subtle at first, then undeniable. The Duke was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors. Arthur took over the estate management with a quiet, terrifying intensity. He was not a tyrant. He did not yell or throw ledgers at the stewards, as his father once had. Instead, he employed a chilling, methodical precision. He sat in the library from dawn until dusk, unraveling decades of complex agricultural accounts. He rode out to the tenant farms himself, no longer to chat about hounds, but to inspect the roofs and audit the grain yields. He was fair. He forgave a debt for a farmer whose son had broken his leg in the harvest. But when the village miller was caught short weighting flour intended for the estate kitchens, Arthur did not offer a gentle reprimand. He evicted the man within 24 hours and seized the mill. The county took notice. The whisperings in the drawing rooms of the neighboring estates changed. The soft Duke of Oakhaven was dead. In his place was a man forged in ice. News of the Harrows trickled in through the relentless, efficient network of servants and tradesmen. It was brought to Constance one bitter January morning by Beatrice, as the maid brushed out Constance's hair. The magistrate arrived at Oak Hill Manor on Tuesday, Your Grace, Beatrice murmured, her eyes fixed on the silver strands she was pinning up, accompanied by 4 bailiffs from London. Constance paused, setting down her teacup. And they seized everything, Beatrice said, a grim satisfaction in her tone. The furniture, the horses, the silver, even the carpets. It's said Lord Harrow collapsed in the study. The family was given 2 days to vacate the premises. The estate is to be auctioned to settle the gambling debts. And where did they go? Constance asked, keeping her voice entirely neutral. North, they say, to a minor holding belonging to Lady Harrow's spinster sister. A cottage, really. 4 rooms and a leaky roof. Miss Cecily was seen getting into a hired coach. They say she was wearing a brilliant blue Paris silk gown. Beatrice sniffed dismissively. Highly inappropriate for carriage travel in the winter. Constance looked at her own reflection in the vanity mirror. The bruise on her cheek had faded completely, leaving no trace. The cuts on her hands had healed into thin, silvery scars. The pain was gone, but the memory of the heavy silver tray and the vicious slap remained. She felt no triumph. She felt no pity. She simply felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a ledger being balanced. Cecily had wanted to destroy a family to save her own skin. Instead, she had accelerated her own ruin. The world occasionally possessed a brutal poetry. Later that afternoon, Constance walked down the long gallery toward the library. She walked with a cane now, a handsome piece of polished ebony with a silver handle. The damp cold of the carriage ride had permanently settled into her left hip, leaving her with a pronounced limp. It was a physical toll she paid without complaint. She pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the library. Arthur was seated behind the massive oak desk, buried behind stacks of parchment. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the hard planes of his face. He looked older. The lingering traces of boyish softness had been carved away, leaving a stark, handsome patrician bone structure. He looked up as she entered, immediately setting down his pen. He stood up, a sign of respect he had insisted upon reinstating. "Mother, you shouldn't be walking the stairs in this dampness. I'm a duchess, Arthur, not a porcelain doll. If I sit in that armchair any longer, I shall turn into upholstery," Constance said dryly, making her way to a leather wingback chair near the fire. Arthur smiled, a tight, fleeting expression, and came around the desk to sit opposite her. "I was just reviewing the timber contracts for the spring," Arthur said, rubbing his temple. "The London merchants are trying to squeeze our margins. They assume I am inexperienced." "Let them assume," Constance advised, resting her hands on the silver handle of her cane. "Silence is an excellent negotiator. Let them talk until they negotiate against themselves. Then offer them 10% less than their lowest price." Arthur chuckled, a low, rich sound. "You are ruthless." "I am pragmatic." Constance looked at her son closely. "You are working too hard, Arthur. You have not been writing for pleasure in weeks. The hounds are growing fat and lazy." "The estate requires my attention," he said simply. "The estate requires a master, not a martyr," she countered. "You have stabilized the accounts. You have proven you are not to be trifled with. Now you must remember how to live." Arthur stared into the fire, the flames reflected in his dark eyes. "I will, in time. But for now, I find the numbers comforting. They do not lie. They do not pretend to be something they are not." Constance felt a pang of sorrow. He was safe. He was strong. But he was guarded. The open, trusting boy was buried beneath layers of armor. Perhaps one day a woman would come along who could dismantle that armor without a blade. But it would take a very long time, and Constance knew she might not live to see it. "Beatrice informs me the Harrow estate is to be auctioned," Constance said, dropping the subject of his workload. Arthur's expression did not change. Not a flicker of pain, not a twitch of regret. "I am aware. My steward informed me this morning." "Are we placing a bid?" she asked, testing the waters. The Oakhaven lands bordered the Harrow estate on the eastern ridge. It was prime agricultural acreage. Arthur looked back at her. His eyes were completely clear. "No, the soil is depleted, and the manor house requires a fortune in roof repairs. It is a bad investment." He had stripped all emotion from the decision. It was purely transactional. Cecily Harrow was no longer a broken heart. She was simply bad soil and a leaky roof. "Very well," Constance said, tapping her cane lightly on the floorboards. "I leave the matter in your capable hands." She stood up slowly, her joints protesting with a dull ache. Arthur immediately stood to offer his arm, but she waved him away with a flick of her wrist. "I can manage, Your Grace. I'm going to the conservatory. The orchids need pruning, and the head gardener is far too timid with the shears." Arthur watched her walk toward the doors. "Mother?" Constance paused, turning her head. "Thank you," Arthur said. The words carried the weight of the entire estate, of his future, of the man he had become. Constance did not offer a warm, maternal smile. She gave him a sharp, knowing nod. She looked down at her right hand, where the faint, jagged scar from the paring knife crossed her thumb. "Ensure the timber merchants sign the contracts by Friday, Arthur," she said briskly. "Or find new merchants." She walked out into the corridor, the rhythmic tap of her cane echoing against the stone walls. Oakhaven was secure. The wolves had been kept at bay, and the Duchess, though bruised and slightly battered, remained entirely undefeated. "Thank Thank you so much for reading this story. If you felt the chill of that drawing room and loved watching Constance protect her son at all costs, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Share this tale with anyone who loves historical drama with a fierce, unapologetic protagonist, and don't forget to subscribe for more immersive, deeply grounded stories every single week. What did you think of Arthur's final revenge? Let me know in the comments below. Your support keeps these stories coming.